Hi, this is Mothiur Rahman. I'm from New Economy Law, and I've got on the call here Peter Gabel and Nanette Schorr from an organization called PISLAP, which stands for Project for Integrating Spirituality, Law and Politics in the US. And this call is just the beginning of what will be an hour-long conversation with the part of the Justice Week debates and talks looking at how the legal system in the UK is changing and being disrupted, and what we need to consider to enable a more equitable justice system. I think in the words here of the Law Society, it was, with many parts of the UK system at breaking point, they believe, they being the Law Society, Bar Council and SILEX, believe now is the time to make a strong and clear case for why justice is so fundamental to the UK society, economy and democracy, helping place them at the centre stage of public political debate. So Nanette and Peter, do you want to just introduce yourselves?
Hi everyone, very happy to be a part of this. My name is Nanette Schorr. I live in New York City, and I'm one of the co-founders of PISLAP with Peter. And I have been involved in PISLAP for over 20 years now. And in my full-time legal work, which is separate from PISLAP, I work in an office that provides free legal help for the low-income community, a sector of the low-income community here in New York City. Where you might call it, probably in the UK, you call it legal aid. My areas of practice are family law and education law. And of course, thinking about justice is something I both do for a living and do in my work with PISLAP. So I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you.
And I am Peter Gabel, and I'm speaking to you from my home in San Francisco, California. And I've been a law professor for some 40 years. And during that time, I devoted most of my work, although I taught at UC Berkeley and at the University of Minnesota in the US, the vast majority of my time, and City University of New York as well, vast majority of my time was spent at a 60s inspired public interest law school in San Francisco called New College of California School of Law, where I have taught. New College is now closed after 30-some years. We were like Atlantis, we rose out of the sea, and eventually, as the 60s ebbed away, went back under the sea. But I continue to teach at local law schools, John F. Kennedy Law School out here in the Bay Area. And I have historically taught contracts most years, and also contract law, you would probably call it in the UK, and law and social change, the politics of law practice, law and social activism. I'm an editor of Tikkun magazine, a progressive Jewish quarterly, and well, with Nanette, I have put quite a bit of energy to creating, with Nanette and others, the project for integrating spirituality, law, and politics.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful to get that background. Just to give you a bit of background as to why I think Justice Week is happening, and the sort of legal framework of changes on political and funding changes. There have been a lot of, I think, Nanette mentioned about doing family law and legal aid work, and that area of legal aid work has had drastic cuts in the UK over the last few years, which has reduced the ability of families and people sort of on the poverty edge, looking up benefits and welfare law, family law, not able to access lawyers, and there's an increase in them representing themselves, particularly in regulatory tribunals as well, with nurses and teachers having to represent themselves against the regulatory bodies that sometimes hold their job, their employment in their hands, and they've got much more money to have barristers, etc., representing them. So there's a kind of inequality that is arising. And there's also the Legal Services Act 2007, which set up the Legal Services Board not very long ago. And that is an oversight body for all the different professional bodies of barristers and solicitors and stylists. And that oversight body has a duty. And that duty does talk about to uphold the rule of law and the public interest and access to justice, but it also talks about the protection of the interests of consumers as something that it is representing. And there's some feeling that that area of protecting and seeing law as a consumer-led service may be impacting upon how we understand justice, like the wide understanding of justice and what it actually means to have the rule of law within society. It's not just about consumers meeting their needs. So that's a question that we can sort of like think about to frame this conversation around whether who is justice, who is the law serving? Is it the needs of commercial practices and commercial ventures, or civil society? And I think, and I remember hearing you say something about law as a transformative practice in one of your in the PISLAP's work, and that would be something that's really interesting to hear from you, what you mean by that. Yeah, and Peter, do you?
Sure. Well, I think in PISLAP we see law as not only, as you expressed, Mothiur, just the instrument by which commercial or other kinds of disputes are resolved, but a force that has the potential to really be transformative of the culture, to manifest and to reflect the real connections that we as a human community or as a nation in this situation share with each other, the bonds that we share with those that we're in relationship with, whether it's those we are more at arm's length with, we make a purchase from, or we rent from, or any of those kinds of relationships, to more intimate relationships, spousal relationships, parents and children. But justice, in view of PISLAP, is a force which brings to bear in the legal process our love, our care, our compassion, our commitment to equity, to inclusiveness, to a genuine commitment to each other's well-being. So I think that's a bigger vision of love. We like to use the words of Martin Luther King Jr. Love is justice, is love correcting that which revolts against love. That beautiful statement of his is kind of a touchstone for PISLAP's, for expressing PISLAP's vision. So that's some of what we mean.
I love that phrase. Could you just repeat? Justice is love correcting
that which revolts against love.
Great. Peter, can you explain the thinking that brought politics, law, and spirituality together? Because it's very, in England, I guess the word spirituality is used in particular ways, and I'm wondering how you see that, or PISLAP sees that word spirituality within politics and law.
So historically, the struggles of lawyers to expand the rights of marginalized people, people who've been discriminated against, oppressed people, has had a highly rationalistic framework seeking to get people their rights within the existing system. But social movements for transformation of the society actually always bring about sort of a fundamental elevation of human connectedness and a higher moral awareness of people as they aspire to transforming the world. So we have been aware of the limitations of the legal system as we have inherited it because of its individualistic nature and its inability to see the world through a truly social lens. And there's, in the case of many of the great social movements in the past, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, all of these movements have to some extent foundered in a legal arena that only sees the world as being made up of what we in PISLAP sometimes call disconnected monads, of floating separate individuals, each with his or her own bundle of right, with the main focus of that of American law, and I'm sure it's true of British law as well, being to protect the individual against abuses by others or by the state. That framework from the 18th century, we feel, is not adequate to the present day moral needs of human beings, which is to see other people as sacred, to be able to apprehend their fundamental and open-hearted humanity, and their longing to live in a world in which we can truly see and be seen by the other in a empathic, compassionate, and caring way. So in our view, at least as I would put it, the spiritual dimension is it's not based on the economic needs of the person, what we focus on, or per se, anyway. We are very concerned about those, but the narrow conception of economic benefits and legal rights is insufficient to speak to what the moral needs of human beings actually are. And we feel that there's a spiritual dimension to human needs that involves being able to see one another as fully human and as sacred beings, and not in a religious sense, but in an open-hearted sense, and to have a justice process that heals broken relationships rather than only parceling out rights among socially separated individuals. So we're actually trying to, the way I would put it is, on the one hand, we are committed to carrying out the rest of the liberal revolutions of the 18th century and the expansion of rights to all that have been denied them. But we are also at the beginning of creating another kind of legal culture that emphasizes our human connection rather than our separation, and healing what separates us and breaks us apart, rather than seeing us as mere individual bearers of rights and obligations.
That's brilliant. Yeah, thank you. That's really, there's a lot there to sort of delve into. Things I took away from that just is about laws of social transformation, and that there's a limitation in the way that the law is conceived in individualizing, seeing ourselves as individuals and not seeing the social, applying a social lens. And so this idea of, which we do have in the UK, of protecting the individual interests against the abuses of the state isn't sufficient. You also talked about the moral need. This is really interesting. I think I mentioned, we will go on to the PISLAP conference, but you mentioned moral needs, and I just wonder whether both of you could just tease this thing around the legal positivism framework, as I understand it, Hart's, and I mean, I didn't do legal jurisprudence, I did a conversion course, but that is trying to say that the law is just what it is. It's not, you don't think about what the law ought to be. You only apply yourselves and your application to the law as it is. And I'm wondering, are you saying that that framework of legal positivism isn't sufficient?
Yes. Speaking for myself, Nanette, you can speak to it too. Yes, I would say that's exactly our view. That's the dilemma that you face, apparently, from your description of the situation in England. That's the dilemma, or the UK, I should say. That's the dilemma that you're facing when people want to make it a merely commercial or consumer-driven activity. Is that that positivist view treats people, does not capture the moral bond that links self to other, that links us all to each other, and the realization of a morally humane, caring, and good world, which ought to be at the core of law and the legal process. So when you have this focus on consumer law as a kind of consumer-oriented activity, the picture of the world thus imagined is it not, of a lot of socially separated people, each with their own interests, and they go to a lawyer in order to get those interests taken care of or realized by paying a price for it. It's like buying anything else in the marketplace. That's totally contrary to who human beings really are, which is that we are moral beings existing in relation to each other. And we have moral needs as human beings that need to be spoken to by the legal culture.
And maybe just to add something to Peter's voice there, in PISLAP, we not only think about transformation of the legal system, we see that transformation as needing to be embedded in transformation of the entire culture, or in manifesting the values that Peter was talking about throughout the culture, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in governance, whether it's in civil society organizations, whether it's in corporate and business structures, that these values of presence, of manifesting the moral presence of each other, of ourselves to each other, so that PISLAP is embedded in a larger vision. And I think that's an important to speaking about changes in the justice system, that we're looking to a change that is throughout the culture, that's the way it's most likely to come about.
Yeah,
could I add one more thing to what Nanette said there? So that we go back and forth, she and I, which is that the skepticism that you might have felt initially, or that some might feel in hearing us, that what does spirituality have to do with this, is itself a legacy of the very positive and important separation of church and state that occurred over several hundred years, a few hundred years ago, realized most fully a few hundred years ago in both of our countries. But the way I would put it is that, maybe it's not the greatest metaphor, but the baby was thrown out with the bathwater. In other words, the oppressive nature of religious persecution that led to the individualist, in a way, one factor that led to the individualist revolutions, and the separation of church and state, also was accompanied by denying the spiritual dimension of our social world altogether. And that's unfortunate, and we need to repair that, because it produces an alienated society in which people exist only in their own isolated routines, often blocked from their fulfillment of their human aspirations by the inability to connect with each other and to exist in a world in which that connection is fostered. So, and the legal culture that we create, if we can do it right, and this is what PISLAP is trying to help think through and support, ought to be an arena in which that social healing of love correcting that which revolts against love, that's, as Martin Luther King put it, that social healing can occur through law. And we can tell you about what we tried to do at the last conference that exemplifies those efforts.
Yeah, that would be great if you could just go into a bit more about the conference.
Nanette, would you describe the four groups if you've got them in the forefront of your mind? Oh, maybe she can't.
She's frozen.
Yeah. Shall I continue then?
Yes.
Or
I think she may be frozen on the screen. That's the
one. Oh, she's temporarily cut off, so she'll probably come back in a second now. Well, so what we did at the last conference is we had 4 tracks.
Okay, I'm back.
Oh, you're back.
Sorry. My internet's a little stable. I'm back from we had, as Peter was starting to say, we had 4 tracks in the conference. One to do with contemplative practices. Of course, a lot of the people are into mindfulness, meditation, restorative circles, many other kinds of practices that have a more contemplative nature. So how do those integrate? How do those contribute to legal and social transformation and social justice? Our second theme was to do with transforming legal education. And I'll let Peter speak, leave it to Peter to speak a little bit more to what that's about. The third is to transform the actual practice of law. So for example, how to create deeper and more connected attorney-client relationships where the relationship is not just relating to the exact legal problem the client came in with, but is a more holistic look at the client's needs as an individual, as a human being in the social community, and also about the bond and connection between the lawyer and the client, as well as many other aspects of how practice is organized around money, related to the environment, related to how we deal with space, and with many other pieces of organizing legal practice. And then the fourth is fostering the use of restorative practices, mediation, collaborative law, alternative practices that are creating parallel justice tracks outside of the court system, and that provide stronger opportunities for healing than cases do that are occurring in a traditional, adversarial model. So those are the four themes that the conference explored through plenaries, through workshops, and also through experiential dimensions. Peter, do you want to add some?
Well, I mean, so let's before tackling legal education, let's think of one of the presentations was from the Georgia Justice Project in the United States, and this was in area group 3 about transforming the practice of law. And this is these are remarkable criminal defense lawyers who make permanent, when clients come in, they have a contract with them that's a permanent contract, a contract for life, meaning that they will handle the legal problem, but they take the whole client in. And if the client's convicted, they visit them in jail while they're there. If the client is acquitted or released, they help the client to find work. The client becomes part of the community of the law practice. And there's a kitchen in the law practice, and they have they serve dinner for all their clients, former and present clients. There really are no former clients in this model, but all their clients twice a year. And they have this law firm involves itself in the families of the clients' lives and in supporting the totality of their efforts to succeed in the world. And so it's a beautiful example of a spiritually oriented criminal defense practice that takes on the whole client with a permanent commitment, not just a momentary commitment to handle a rationally understood legal claim. So that's the kind of people who presented at our conference in many different ways.
And how is that funded? Because that's a really important. There was I remember reading about a family law court, a judge who set up a family law court, which has had a very similar feel to what you're saying, that the whole person is taken in, and everything is trying to be a more holistic approach. Even though it was shown to be effective, the grant funding or the government funding was cut, and now all that learning is just falling away. And so I'm just interested to know how it's funded.
Well, they're funded by private foundations who support their work, the Georgia Justice Project. So they have a whole strategy for receiving funding from private foundations who support this kind of work. But Nanette, maybe you could speak about ways that you try to do this in publicly funded legal services, which is where you are a lawyer.
Right. Yes, so some of the same...
I think
you're frozen again. Well, I'll let... Oh, you're back. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Nanette.
In civil legal services, which is primarily government funded, we also try to bring some of the same approaches into our practice. We have, we do a lot of, we spend a lot of time connecting to the communities that we work in. We build relationships with community leaders and community organizations. We connect our clients to them, and we try to deepen our own relationships with our clients in many different ways. So we're working on two levels. One is resolving the client's individual situation, but the other is having an impact, having a broader impact on the systems in which clients live and work, and giving and making sure that there's a lot of self-determination in the way that clients are treated and relate to the legal system and the community.
And how is that funded within
government?
Government, right. That's interesting. And in terms of the areas of law then that are covered by the audience who was at PISLAP, what areas, I mean, are you catering for? Which people's practices? You mentioned criminal law and civil, family.
I would say it's very broad. It's pretty much the whole legal culture. So anyone who is interested in these issues, and it manifests differently. For example, we had a lawyer in PISLAP who worked for a large corporation and brought what he the values of PISLAP into counseling his client on environmental sustainability, accountability to workers, to the community they worked in. So he used that in working with his large corporate client. It could be anyone from solo practitioners to people that work for institutions, for law firms. We really try to cover the gamut. And these kind of more restorative models are growing. I mean, medical malpractice cases where there's been medical error, they're having restorative circles where there's accountability and discussion of what occurred. There's more transparency. There could be apology. There's restitution. So it's really addressed to all sectors of the legal culture.
And are you able to, you mentioned, I'm just interested when you said that the Georgia justice practice was met, the funding was by private foundations. What is it that they see as a benefit? Is it, because I'm interested to see how, as the state is becoming much narrower and less fundable, has less money, what alternative mechanisms there are for funding these kinds of needs, and whether these foundations are seeing, for example, that by funding this now, there's a greater social good, that is a more social capital in the future, so that's why they're funding it, or is there a model that they work with?
When they pursue funding, they show the reduction in recidivism rates that results from this kind of practice and compare it to traditional criminal defense practice. So in a traditional criminal defense case in the U.S., first there's very high volume public defenders that are paid for by the government who can't do much, let's put it, or feel they can't because they have such high caseloads. But in criminal defense practice generally, the common practice is to plead a client out of the process, that is, plead guilty to a lesser offense in order to get a shorter sentence or no jail time. Then the client goes right back into the culture that he or she came from and is perfectly likely to recommit the same crimes or related crimes. Whereas when they go through the transformative process of the Georgia Justice Project, they can demonstrate there's a much lower rate of recidivism, much higher social benefit from this form of practice. And then they're also very skilled people. They lobby the legislature. They've created many criminal justice reforms within the state legislature of Georgia. And so they have a public visibility and impact through that route as well. But, of course, the argument is partly based on things like lowering the recidivism rate, a very traditional argument for what is working in a criminal defense practice, even though the actual vision of the Georgia Justice Project is much more ambitious and much higher level of consciousness than that.
In a way, then, when you say, so that's looking at because when you said the 4 tracks, you were saying the number 3 was actual practice of the law. I was thinking, okay, it's public law, or is it commercial law, etc. But you're also looking at the machinery by which decisions are made and how they begin to impact upon people's lives, as in, when you make as you say, a criminal, the actual regulatory way in which law is shaped And is that a separate thing, or is that within the track 3? How you begin to understand how the actual system of law is.
The law is constructed, in other words, the substance of the law, the legislation itself. Is that what you're referring to?
Not just the legislation, but for example, like with divorce, I know when some of the practices of seeing how the adversarial system of divorce creates itself a way in which people's needs aren't being met. So you create a contract by which you say we won't go to court. And so that means that the advocates will do their best to not go to court, rather than actually being incentivized to go to court. So it's like looking at incentives as well as like, and how do you see that as another kind of branch, or does that fall within one of these branches? What are the incentives by which decisions and lawyers do create their practices?
Well, I think, the founder of what you were describing, which is called collaborative law here in the US, is somebody named Stu Webb. And he's actually presented at the conference and is involved in PISLAP. And yes, there are certainly certain incentives there because in his case, it's family law or divorce cases specifically. And his experience was that taking divorces through court can be very detrimental to the well-being of the children, to their, can cause trauma both to the children and certainly to the adults involved, and can also impair the ability of the parents to maintain an ongoing relationship and co-parent as, post-divorce. So there can be some really adverse impacts of going through the litigation process. So the incentive, I think, for this kind of model is to avoid that traumatic impact of litigation. And the lawyers make essentially a no litigation pledge. And so if the collaborative process doesn't work out, then the parties will have to find other lawyers to go to court. So I guess that, there is a certain incentive that's built into that system. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah. I think so. It's just trying to think of different, I think for the audience as well, like how do we begin to open our practices to different ways in which we could practice together, and that could be an interesting thing for them. I see we're coming to 30 minutes, so that was really fast, actually. So there was a lot more questions I wanted to ask, and maybe I'll just end on this. I know that you come from Martin Luther King's values and his approaches when you were talking about spirituality, and I was just wondering how you saw that shaping into the 4 tracks that you're talking about through the conference. You want to take that one?
Well, I mean, they're all explicitly in the tracks, because the tracks, first, the meditative track, which is basically not about private escapism, but about how can centering kind of spiritual practice that center one's own being as a lawyer make social change more likely to occur and be effective in bringing it about. So that's clearly related to King's quality, let's put it that, quality of presence and the relationship of that presence to creating social change. Transforming legal education, our whole focus is in simultaneously getting our students through the bar exam, which you have to teach them to become masters of the rules and manipulators and good at analytical skills, but also recognizing that the hyper focus on analytical rule manipulation is inadequate to address the problems of our clients and our communities. So fostering the depth of intuition, empathy, and compassion in each of these cases, and seeking remedies that are not just money damages, but remedies that repair communities, is a new spiritually informed way of trying to teach the next generation of lawyers how to think about what their work is, instead of just cranking them out. I suspect you have a similar kind of problem in legal education in Great Britain, which is one case after another. Analyze it and then take a big test, and you're a master manipulator of concepts. And that's a very inadequate conception of legal reasoning. So we challenge that. And of course, the fourth, we talked about the third group, the transforming law practice, but the fourth group on restorative justice, the whole point of restorative justice is in a circle format to foster apology, forgiveness, and mutual understanding out of conflict. Well, of course, that's the last thing that the adversary system does as it's currently structured. And the people who are our restorative justice people this is their whole contribution, really, to teach us how to do that.
Mm. I'm sure that there's a lot there for, I'm hoping, the audience who will be coming on to grapple with and ask you further questions. So I've come to the end of the time here. So I will end the recording, but just to say thank you for some really good sort of, responses and sort of beginning to understand the approach that PISLAP is taking, and I hope it can really help in the UK. And so I'll leave it to Geeta now to take over the next stage. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.